Hello, thank you for tuning in to my channel. This is Jade Marie with Jay's Jewels. Thank you so much for joining in today. Again, today we're going to be having a very tough conversation. This is part 2 of my series on systemic racism. And basically, just based on the climate of the country right now and many of the things that we're seeing in the media, regardless of your age, race, gender, it's almost no way that you cannot notice some of the things that are going on within our society. What I wanted to do was I wanted to help individuals understand what systemic racism is, and also, of course, there's a good bit of rhetoric around white privilege. And many of our white counterparts do not understand what white privilege is, or they feel like they don't have access to white privilege. It's just because it's just because they've worked hard, or it's just because they have a degree and things of that nature. And so what I wanted to do was, some of this rhetoric even goes on within the African American community and other minority communities. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about what systemic racism was, because several of these practices started in the 1800s. Many people have really lost touch with what it is, and they don't see how the systemic racism is we can still feel it today in 2020. So thank you so much for tuning into my channel. Please take a few minutes to like, share, and subscribe. You all already know, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can feel free to comment below the video. And without further ado, I am going to get all into this topic. It is very, very juicy. Yes, I have my notes because this topic, it's in depth and it is very layered. So the first thing that we're going to just talk about are Jim Crow laws. So for the part 1, I talked about redlining, and I also talked about the GI Bill, but I really kind of put some thought into it, and I said I need to go back a little bit further. Yes, these laws kind of show significant amounts of information in terms of what's going on today and what we saw going on then. However, people don't know that there was groundwork even before some of these laws were established. And really a big part of what I want to shed light on today is how Jim Crow laws, and even just the character Jim Crow period, still affects the way that we see people of color. Not only people of color, not only minorities, but particularly very dark skinned people, such as myself, or what my family typically looks like. So I wanted to really shed light, because this is a topic that has gone without conversation for very long. So let's jump right in. Jim Crow, these laws were created specifically to marginalize African American people, disenfranchise African American people. These laws were throughout the nation. I don't think all 50 states had Jim Crow laws, but the majority of them did have Jim Crow laws. And what these laws did were they did several things. They denied, or they inhibited African American people to vote. They also inhibited them from being able to get certain types of jobs, as well as education. And so when we look at the fabric of our country, when we look at what America really stands for in terms of this being the country of opportunity, we see immediately with Jim Crow laws, which these laws were very heavily prevalent in our country between 1867 or 1876 and 1965. So for about 100 years, these laws were very heavily present throughout our nation, and again in the majority of our states, the states within our country. So when we look at these, we see that economic justice for Black people, it was not in place. Jim Crow affected the types of jobs that African Americans could have access to, as well as it really limited them from really being able to go for jobs which they had the mental altitude to do, but they were never given the fair opportunity, as well as education. I mean, even I spoke with my grandmother maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we were just having a casual conversation, but what she said really resonated with me. My grandmother will be 90 this year. And what she said was, when she was a child, African Americans went to school for 3 months in a year. Not the regular 8 to 9 month schedule that even then their white counterparts had, or the schedule that we see that's available for our children and the children of our country today. Typically, children go to school for about 8 to 9 months. African Americans were not afforded that opportunity. They went to school for 3 months, and then when it was planting season, when it was harvest season, which is about the majority of the time, you can plant plants and things like that of all different of all different seasons of the year. When it was that time, they were out in the field picking cotton, chopping cotton, planting, tilling to the land and things of that nature. So already we see disenfranchisement. But not only that, the schools that they went to were, one-room schools with probably anywhere from 7 to 8 grades, 1 to 2 teachers, probably 50 to 60 kids in these classroom settings, and you're trying to work with all these different components and still educate the children. And my grandmother now, she's had her master's, but my grandmother has her master's degree. But let's just put that into context. Nowadays we see many African American women. We know that African American women are the highest educated demographic group in our country. But let's think about just the type of persistence that you would have had to have at that point in time. Because if you're used to having a limited amount of education, oftentimes what it will do is it will prohibit you from being able to truly see the value in education, because you're only being educated 3 months out of the year. So 1/4 of a year you're afforded education, and this was typically during winter time. So not only were you having access to limited education for a limited time period, but you also had to go during winter time. And typically during these times, this is when we hear stories of our grandparents and great grandparents say, they had to walk 2 and 3 miles to get to a school, rain, sleet, snow. My grandmother said it herself. It didn't matter what the weather was. They knew when it was time to go to school, because they only had a limited amount of time, whether they were sick, whatever the weather was like, they had to go. And their parents, of course, pushed them to do that. But let's just think about what that must have been like for them. So these are some of the things that we see going on with Jim Crow law. It also inhibited other opportunities for African American individuals. Now, the Jim Crow laws, they have roots that go beyond 1876. And so the roots of Jim Crow law were not only based off of a fictional character that I will get into a little bit later in this segment, but Jim Crow laws were based off what was called then black codes. And these black codes, which basically they kind of evolved from the 13th Amendment, from the ratification of the 13th Amendment. What the white people of that particular time, they said, African Americans, they're free, but we need to come up with another way to limit the access to what they have. We don't see them as our equals. So what can we do to prohibit their socioeconomic growth so that they do not become as powerful or economically sustainable as we are? And so black code basically denoted what African Americans could make. These laws also, which was very, very interesting to me, they kind of really said what the formerly enslaved could do. So it's saying, hey, you're no longer a slave, but we're going to put these codes out there for our white counterparts to know. And what these codes will do is, even though, let's say we've taken the prison, you're free. So we've taken the bars, the physical bars from around you. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put systemic laws, not the bars, but we're going to put systemic laws that are essentially invisible bars. These invisible bars and these systemic laws will still hold you back significantly from the progress that you will see. And so many people talk about, okay, Juneteenth. African Americans, they were set free on Juneteenth in the mid 1800s. Black people were free. So why weren't they able to X, Y, and Z? Well, let's think about that. After they were free, there were additional things put in place to still make sure that Black people, that their starting line was miles, I mean literally hundreds of miles back from what their white counterparts' starting line would have been. So that's just very interesting to me that, again, once the physical bars of slavery were removed, that's when we really see systemic. And again, this is what this series is all about. What systemic racism is and how it really got started. Black Code, Jim Crow laws. So not only will we'll say you're free on paper, but we will have laws that will pretty much make sure that you're still in a mental mindset of slavery, and also, again, that you don't have the opportunities that you feel like you were afforded. And so many people say, okay, this is when slavery ended. Many slave owners did not tell their slaves that they were free. Even once African Americans became free, many slave owners, particularly throughout the South, and again, I'm getting a little passionate about this because it's the history of our country, and it's a history that we all need to acknowledge, not just African Americans, not just white people who are the descendants of slave owners and individuals who have access to white privilege. This is information that we all need to know, so that when we talk about prejudice, when we talk about when you see a young Black boy in a hoodie and you become nervous, or whatever the case may be, this is mental programming that started in the 1800s, even before then, but particularly within the mid 1800s. That's when we really began to see the mental programming of the disenfranchisement of people of color, and particularly, again, I'm going to keep referring to this term, but Black people, African American people. So these codes were used widely throughout the South, and basically it was a legal way to put Black citizens in indentured service. So these laws said, hey, you think you're free, but you're out past 7 o'clock. Boom, now you're an indentured servant. So what it also did was, once Black people began to gain a little bit of momentum within their freedom and just wanting to live life as a free person, which we all do. And I mean, again, right now, we don't know what it was like. We can conceptualize it, but just to have that personal experience, we could never really experience that. But what we're going to do is we're going to put additional laws in place just to trip you up to do what? Put you back into indentured servitude, which is slavery. It also, these Black codes, they could remove African American people's rights to vote. So we can allow you, if you violate these Black codes, you can become an indentured servant, which is a slave again. You will also be denied the right to vote. These laws also control the way that African Americans, the way that they traveled, where they lived. And these laws could even seize their children. So here we see very early on, one thing that slavery did was it definitely put a huge hole in the fabric of the African American family. People talk about, well, Why is it that the Black community, in terms of our out of wedlock rate and just things of that nature, why is it like that? Well, it's because of social programming. People could have their children seized away from them if they violated laws that were oftentimes not explicitly even told to African American people. It was just like, oh, you did something wrong. Oh, you looked at a white woman. Oh, you did this. Now these are the major punishments that you will receive due to these actions that oftentimes you didn't even know or realize that you were violating, because at this point in time you're thinking that you're a free person. So now, as we really look at it, even the state that I live in the state of Tennessee. The state of Tennessee had 20 Jim Crow laws, and again, these laws came from Black Code. The state of Texas had 29. This is huge. I mean, these laws talked about who they could marry, where they could live, the type of education that they could have. And what these laws did was they basically mandated segregation. So Black Code, which evolved into Jim Crow laws, they mandated segregation. This is where we get into the term separate but equal, which is really confusing, but separate but equal. But we're here, but you're equal, but we're going to make sure that everything is separate. And so when we think about laws being in place to mandate segregation, as well as to uphold the inferior treatment of Black people, we really have to look at the fabric of our country. And then oftentimes I have many friends of many nationalities. And many of them will say, I am not a racist, Jade. No, I'm not a racist. However, we still have to look at that generational undertone that still runs within our bloodline. And so if these are things that my grandmother faced, then oftentimes you should think about the mental perspective that the white grandfathers, great grandfathers, and even mothers and fathers, and the influence that they've had on their children. We already know that racism is taught. It's not something that you inherently get. It's something that's taught. You're taught to treat people differently. You're taught to look at people differently and things of that nature. And again, I really want to also keep referring to the social programming, because oftentimes we don't even realize when we're being socially programmed, but we can see the effects of social programming from Jim Crow laws as well as from Black Code, and how we still see this undertone even right now today. So again, we're talking about it upheld the inferior treatment of African American people. This was also a systematized way. So when I looked it up on Wikipedia and several other, sources of research that I was able to conduct, even in the literature I read, you see where it says systematized. These things were systematized. We're talking about laws. We're talking about the way that states, local counties, cities, as well as even some things on a federal level were operating. And this is why we talk about systemic racism. Oftentimes people can't grasp what that is, but we see that many of these laws were systematized even back in the mid 1800s. These things were put in place. So it just, sometimes it really breaks my heart when people say, well, why isn't that Black people can't do better? Slavery was 400 years ago. Well, sweetheart, even when slavery ended, there were different laws systematized to still disenfranchise African American people as well as people of color. I will always speak from my personal perspective, which is an African American Black woman. However, these laws oftentimes also affected Chinese individuals, Japanese individuals, mulatto individuals, which were people that are of mixed race. Of course, typically they were labeled as Black, but now within 2020, mixed race and biracial, they do somewhat have their own category, and I totally acknowledge that. But we see, and even Native Americans, I mean, it said Indian. And when you look at the laws, they refer to them as Indians, but these were the Native Americans. So these were the people that were on this land before anybody else was, and they were also disenfranchised. So again, just really thinking about what was going on. So even we talked about the economic piece, where Black people could work, how much they could get paid. We talked about the educational piece, the separate but equal, the segregation part of it. White people did not want their children to be educated around African American people. And so when we think about this, and when we look at even our school systems of today, we still see very strong hints of segregation, but most of the time we see it operated under the title of private school, or we see it within what we call the suburban areas. So within the suburban areas, schools do better because the property values are higher, and all of this goes into the funnel that helps pay for education. And then when we go to the inner city, we see more renters, we see more subsidized education and things of that nature. Well, all of this kind of comes from redlining. All of this comes again from systemic racism, things that have always been in place. The next thing that we see is just the disadvantages as well as the injustices that occurred in California. So, of course, we know these things occurred in the South, but again, like I said, these laws were in place in majority of the states in our country. But even in California, it was against the law to marry. And this was all across the South, but it was against the law to marry someone, for a white and an African American individual to marry. But not only that, in California, did you know it was against the law? Against the law for an African American person to even present evidence against a Caucasian, an Anglo-Saxon, a white person. They could have been robbed, raped, looted, mistreated, murdered, which is one of them. Like, if we think about what really shed light on this Black Lives Matter issue, even in California, if someone during that time period, if a white man killed my husband who provided for my home, if he murdered my husband and I saw it with my own two eyes, it was against the law for me to present any evidence, my testimony, what I saw, what he had on, even if I wrote the tag number down or whatever people were doing back then. As a Black person, I could not even present in a court of law evidence against a white person. So, I mean, let's really think about that. Okay. I mean, and it's not funny. It's just when people don't understand what systemic racism is, that's why I'm doing this entire series, because it's a history lesson. Our country has a nasty history the land of the free, the home of the brave. I'm not sure if I would want to live anywhere else other than America. I've never had the opportunity to truly live in another country. But let's think about the history, the undertone. Black people could not be heard in a court of law within any state in our country. If it were in any state, it would be it's just terrible. But to think about California, and there were other states that had laws like this as well, but I wanted to particularly shed light on California because, of course, people always, throw a little shade at the South. We know that the South was the worst in terms of slavery, in terms of discrimination, in terms of prejudice, in terms of racism. We know nobody does that like the South. However, do not think that because you did not live in the South that you had nothing to do with it. Check your state's laws and how they've evolved over time. But I guarantee you, if you go back to the 1800s and you look at some of the laws in your states, you'll be surprised what was going on. Okay. These laws also talked about, again, I already touched on this, that you couldn't present evidence against a white person, even transportation, even housing. So, I mean, and I touched on this with the GI Bill on part one. Please check it out. I'll make sure to link that video below. But even, the housing, people oftentimes, well, why do black people live in the ghetto? Sweetheart, we didn't create the ghetto. We didn't choose to live in the ghetto. We did not choose to live in the inner city. These were oftentimes the only place where we could legally live without being harassed. Many times, many times, there are hundreds of riots that you can look up in history, even when African Americans created their own communities, their own black towns. If you're from the South, you've heard of a black town. Their own communities, their own black towns where they had a few businesses, they had maybe a small grocery store, they just did their own thing. Many times, majority of the times, almost 100% of the times, white people oftentimes did riots in these black communities. They oftentimes looted these black communities. They oftentimes ran black people out of their home in the middle of the night, as well as murdered them. So just that rhetoric around black people living in the communities that they live in, trust me, even when they tried to live in better areas, they were often murdered. Even when they tried to just live in their own areas, there were consequences and repercussions for that. This also, again, housing, but health care. Okay, we all know that African American women are, I want to say, maybe 6 to 7 times more likely to die while in the hands of a healthcare professional than any other counterpart, but particularly their white counterpart. So let's think about, it's not just African Americans being unhealthy. It's not them being unclean. We even see some of this with COVID-19. But this has to do with the undertone that literally goes into almost every industry that we still see today. So again, Jim Crow, healthcare, and even in North Carolina, this was really interesting. When it came to books, black and white kids could not even share books. The first race that touched the book, and oftentimes blacks and African Americans, we already know their books and things were just handed down. It was just what other counterparts did not want. But even books, even education, even sources of knowledge were affected by Jim Crow laws as well as Black Code. So these are just things that we really have to think about and put into context. Now, one of the things I want to just kind of highlight here is the reason why federal, state, and local elections are so important. And that's because federal, state, and local government oftentimes adopted these Jim Crow laws. They oftentimes adopted the Black Code. And basically, what it did was it just heavily stacked the odds against African American people. And we see that even now. We see that. But even then, we see where, again, this programming, where this foundation was laid. And so we're putting things into context. You as an individual, you may not be a quote unquote racist, but you do have to look at history and really see what the history of racism has done to disenfranchise and basically just hinder the existence of Black people in America. But when we looked at the odds being heavily stacked against Black citizens in this country, one thing that is important to note is that oftentimes judges operated under this Black Code. Oftentimes, after the Civil War, post-Civil War, many of these Confederate soldiers became police officers, which is really, this is where we kind of get into the undertone of what's going on with the police system, and this is why many people are calling for police reform. Yes, there are hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands of African American cops now today. But when we look at the framework and the history of policing in this country, the history of policing came from white men who typically did not own slaves. So this means that their socioeconomic level was significantly lower. They didn't own slaves, but what they could do was to still give these poor white Americans some sense of power and validity. What they allowed them to do was to watch over and oversee black people. And if they get into line, it's now your job to enforce the law or to enforce these codes, the undercurrent, this undertone that we have of basically disenfranchising black people. That's the history of policing in our country. That's where we see police. That's where we see people watching another group of people. Whether you want to say it was for theft, or we wanted to make sure they didn't get away because they were property, XYZ. But even after slavery, of course, clearly, it was almost 100 years before African American people could become a law enforcement officer. So what we see is that the first police officers were oftentimes Confederate soldiers. Confederate soldiers defended racism. They defended slavery. And so if you have individuals who defend slavery, surely once they become a person of the law, we just can't kind of put two and two together to just imagine what their views were on African American people. But not only were these individuals oftentimes law enforcement officers, the other thing was they were judges. So we have captains and people who began to grow in the ranks of the Confederate Army. These individuals often became judges. So we're talking about systems and how these systems come into place. So not only, again, I talked about it in California where an African American individual couldn't even present clear evidence against their white counterpart, but we often see judges who upheld many crimes that white people did against African American people of their time. So that's just something to keep in mind. Just something to really think about. Again, systemic racism. How did it start? Where did it come from? Why do we still see it today? Why do we still need social justice? Why do we need police reform? Because the foundation of it was oftentimes built on just an unfair, unequal, racist perspective, if we're calling a spade a spade. So that was just something that was really interesting to me, to see that some of the first police officers in the country were oftentimes Confederate soldiers. Now, when we talk about Jim Crow, okay, Jim Crow laws, one thing I want to hint on, and I've hinted on several things, but one thing I wanted to hint on was, why is blackface not cool? Why is it not cool to dress like a black person if you're white, if you're a non-black person, okay? Why is it not cool to dress like a black person for Halloween or for a costume party? I'm gonna dress up like Kanye, or just whatever the case may be. Or I'm gonna dress up like this rapper and I'm gonna paint myself black and I'm gonna put on chains and XYZ and I'm gonna just really get into character. Here's why this isn't cool. Jim Crow laws came from a white individual who dressed in blackface. So these laws, who is Jim Crow? Jim Crow is a fictional character. Now, there is some credence to Jim Crow was an actual African American character, or a character within folklore within the African American community during like slave times. He was someone that African Americans looked up to in a folklore, in a story. What a white man did was He basically took a role model in a folklore sense, and he made him an individual to be scared of. He made him an individual to laugh at. He made basically the black man. He really just tore down and really what he did was he created a misperception of what the black man was as well as black people. So let's jump right into it. But again, this is why blackface is not cool. I just wanted to make sure I threw that out there. But again, the original intent of blackface, the original intent of Jim Crow, it was to create a negative stereotype, a negative perspective of African American people, but particularly African American males. All right. So Jim Crow laws, these laws, we already kind of laid a little bit of a foundation, but the character was particularly popular between the late 1820s to about 1840. The laws, again, came from a characterization of a persona by an individual named Thomas D. Rice. So Thomas D. Rice, he was an actor, and he did not really gain a significant amount of popularity until he created a piece called Jim Crow, and that's where he put on the ashes and the soot all over his face. He put on tattered clothing, and he just hemmed and hawed, and you know, gave this misperception that all black people spoke in an African American vernacular, or it really was an uneducated vernacular. So let me separate those two. Not only a black vernacular, because we know black vernacular is not uneducated, but what it did was it showed that black people, they don't really know how to communicate. They cut their words off and things of that nature. So he created this character, Jim Crow, and really what he did was, again, he kind of took something that was already created for the upliftment of black people, and then he turned it into a negative. And so at this time, you didn't really have as many movie theaters, so people often were entertained through live entertainment. They went to see plays, they went to see these quick shows and things of that nature. And so he became extremely popular from impersonating an African American man named Jim Crow. So when we just think about laws being created from a fictional character that portrayed negative stereotypes of African American people, it just, you have to really think about that. Laws, state and local laws were adopted based on Jim Crow, a fictional character from a white man. So you got to think about, like, when people say, I don't have that's definitely white privilege for you to be a white man and create a fictional character that portrays negative stereotypes about African American men as well as people. And again, this is where we see this social programming in terms of even entertainment. So even after Thomas Rice, once his life ended and things of that nature, we see where our white counterparts consistently portrayed African Americans in a negative perspective for entertainment. Okay? So, I mean, I'm not sure about you, but there's just certain things I can't watch on TV. But to think about someone laughing and making fun of people that were once enslaved, but not only enslaved, these people had laws and systems placed against them to still make sure that after they were no longer enslaved, that they did not have equal opportunities. There was no separate but equal. But let's continue to talk about it. Thomas D. Rice, some people called him Daddy Rice. He became a very well-known minstrel. And some people even call him the father of minstrelsy. Because during his time, that's how he became very, very popular from doing this Jim Crow act. He was married to a lady named Charlotte Gladstone. They did have children, but none of them survived infancy, which was very, very unfortunate. But again, this gentleman, there's definitely something to be said about his influence. We still, if you really think about it, we still see the influence of Thomas Rice's stereotypical portrayment of Black people in entertainment, even now. Even now, if you look at some of the movies that we watch, some of the shows, I mean, even now we see that depending on who the writer is and how the director feels, oftentimes maybe there is a Black defense attorney on this show, but she only gets a few minutes, and oftentimes she may be a little combative. And I mean, that's just to portray the narrative of the angry Black woman and things of that nature. But why did it become so prevalent in entertainment? Well, that's because in the 1800s, people used to get their kicks and giggles from laughing at the same group of people that they disenfranchised. While at the same time, you're being entertained by this information, you begin to also shape your mental perspective from the images that you see. We all know it's very important to pay attention to what a child watches. We all know that if you're even as an adult, it's very important to be intentional about what you watch. But we'll look at it from a child's perspective. We don't allow children to watch sex, drugs, pornography, just partying, just things that we know are not appropriate for children to watch. Why don't we allow them to watch that? Well, because it affects their social programming. It affects what they think is acceptable versus what they think is not acceptable. It affects what they think is okay and normal versus what they think is not okay and normal. The same thing happens in the minds of adults. If you're constantly feeding yourself certain images, these images will begin to skew your perspective to the left or to the right, just depending on what it is that you're watching. So, Thomas D. Rice, a very, very interesting man, he definitely did a number on our country. And I mean, it just is what it is when we really think about it. But he was very popular all the way up until 1840, and then he began to become really sick. He actually became paralyzed just through an illness, and he began to lose his speech and have different speech complications, which is, some would say it's karma. I've read some reviews that said it was karma. You were using your voice and your body to negatively portray these groups of people, which inherently had, I don't think he knew what he was doing and how it would affect our country from hundreds of years afterwards. Of course not. But we do still see it. But he had his own demise. And again, no children, none of his children. Luckily he did not have his own personal legacy to carry out those thought processes when we think about generational curses and things of that nature. But again, he definitely he did not die a good death. He died alone, and he spent most of his time in bars once he was not able to continue to portray that Jim Crow character. So I wanted to make sure that people just really knew what are Jim Crow laws. Most of the time people think if I don't live in the South, Jim Crow laws do not affect me. More than likely they did. Look up your state's history in terms of Jim Crow, and I mean, you can just Google it. Your state name, Jim Crow laws. And if your state had any Jim Crow laws that affected segregation, education, healthcare, economic sustainability, you will see it. And I definitely encourage you to do that, because it's really important to understand not only our country's history, but our state and our local history. And it's not only important to vote for our presidential positions, but these state and local elections are extremely important. So I'm wrapping this video up, but let's think about social programming. Let's think about the effects of it today. Let's make sure that, particularly if you're a non-Black person, that you're not using the framework, the mental programming of something that came out in the 1800s, because that would mean that you're definitely using an outdated perspective, and nobody wants to do that, right? There are reasons why phones upgrade. There are reasons why laptops are now this thin versus that wide, okay? So let's make sure that as technology evolves and as healthcare evolves and education evolves, let's make sure that our perspectives are evolving. If you look at an African American person and you automatically get nervous, or you automatically think they're unclean, or you automatically think they're going to do something to you, you are operating in a mental construct from the mid 1800s, and that definitely needs to be checked. Thank you so much for tuning in to this video. It's about 47 minutes long. It was not my intention, but I wanted to give great detail to the research that I've been doing. And again, if you are a non-Black person, make sure that you have your white privilege, or whatever access you have to white privilege by being non-Black. Have that in check. Advocate for African American people. And most importantly, be pro-equality, not anti-racist. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for tuning in to my channel.